Most of my contract work is dull in a way that's almost reassuring. I handle records digitization and archival cleanup for local government offices and a few legal firms that inherited decades of paper they don't want to think about anymore. The days blur together, scanning boxes, reconciling index numbers, flagging missing exhibits, marking inconsistencies for someone else to decide whether they matter. I usually work late because it's easier to focus when no one is emailing follow-ups. Coffee, 2 monitors, a cheap external drive that hums when it's close to failing. Nothing about it feels investigative. I've had exposure to darknet mirrors mostly because some records never make it into official systems. Retired investigators dump old case files. Whistleblowers upload partial archives. Sometimes it's just sloppy backups that ended up in the wrong place. Part of my job is knowing how to verify those materials without touching anything I shouldn't. So I keep a list of mirrors and leak indexes bookmarked, the same way some people keep trade journals. It's professional overlap, not curiosity. One night I was cross-checking hashes from an old forum index that hadn't been updated in years. Most of the links were dead. One wasn't. It pointed to a directory labeled with a generic case management code, the kind that doesn't mean anything unless you've worked with those systems. There was no description attached, no thread, no comments, no warning, just a checksum string and a note saying rehosted. I logged the access time out of habit. The hosting setup looked ordinary. Basic onion service, no attempt at obfuscation beyond standard routing. The directory structure loaded quickly, which suggested it wasn't being hit much. At the top level was a folder layout I recognized immediately. Jurisdiction codes, year ranges, evidence subfolders. It mirrored law enforcement archival systems I'd handled before, down to the naming conventions and the way metadata was separated from content. I didn't think of it as a find. It felt more like unfinished work, an archive that had been left somewhere because no one wanted to take responsibility for deleting it. I mirrored the directory locally the same way I would any abandoned dataset, verified the checksums, and noted that the file integrity was intact. The timestamps were consistent. Nothing jumped out as staged or sloppy. At the time, it registered as another cleanup problem waiting for context, something to organize, maybe flag, then move on from. Looking back, what stands out isn't the content, it's how familiar it all looked, like it had been built to be handled quietly by people who already knew the process.
Once the files were mirrored, I started cataloging them the way I would any mixed archive. Each top-level folder corresponded to a cold case, organized by jurisdiction code and year. That alone wasn't unusual. Most departments use similar schemas, even when their internal software changes. Inside each case folder were the expected components: scanned incident reports, evidence intake logs, interview summaries, chain of custody forms. I didn't read for narrative. I checked page counts, file sizes, revision dates. I noted which documents were originals and which were later scans. Most of the material matched public records I'd seen before, either through open databases or previous contracts. Same report numbers, same formatting quirks, but there were additions I didn't recognize. Internal memos that weren't part of any disclosure packet. Redacted photographs with file names that suggested standardized camera systems rather than media uploads. CCTV stills referenced only by asset ID and location code, no image previews included. In several cases, the media directories were empty except for index files listing what should have been there. What caught my attention gradually was the timeline metadata. A number of cases marked unsolved showed activity well after their official closure dates. Not just access logs, but updated documents, revised summaries, evidence status changes. These updates were dated years later, sometimes more than a decade. I assumed internal review at first. Cold cases get reopened on paper more often than in practice. Evidence gets reprocessed when technology changes. That kind of administrative noise is normal. As I moved through different jurisdictions, the pattern repeated. Early documents read like investigatory work, narrative summaries, working theories, open-ended questions. Later editions were shorter, procedural, language flattened into checklists and status fields. Phrases like "no further action" and "pending resource allocation" replaced any discussion of leads. The files didn't show resolution, but they did show maintenance. I started logging the update intervals out of habit. Some cases were touched every few years, others annually, almost on schedule. The edits weren't substantial enough to suggest renewed investigation, but they were too consistent to be accidental. Someone or something was keeping track. At the time, I told myself this was just poor data hygiene, legacy systems layered on top of newer ones, departments failing to sunset old records properly. It happens more than people realize. Still, these directories didn't feel abandoned. They didn't read like memorials or forgotten dumps meant to surface online. They felt current, like working files that had been moved somewhere quieter, not closed.
After a few days of cataloging, I started cross-referencing cases across directories, not content, just structure. I compared how files were annotated, how statuses were applied, how cases were marked as complete without being resolved. The same phrasing showed up in jurisdictions that shouldn't have shared internal language. Different states, different decades, identical closure notes. It looked less like coordination and more like inheritance, as if everyone was drawing from the same procedural template without realizing it. As I traced approval paths, responsibility became harder to follow. Early files included signatures, names, even handwritten initials scanned into PDFs. Later updates replaced those with role titles: reviewing officer, case administrator, external liaison. Approvals were logged as completed steps, not decisions made by someone. I assumed this was modernization. Digital systems tend to flatten accountability. Still, the progression was consistent across cases that otherwise had nothing in common. I began noticing tags I didn't recognize from normal casework. Fields labeled resolution stability appeared alongside disposition codes. Another recurring tag was public exposure risk, scored numerically but without explanation. These weren't notes, they were metrics. Some cases marked unsolved in public-facing records were labeled inactive internally, which I took to mean deprioritized. But the files didn't stop there. Inactive cases still received periodic updates, not investigative ones, administrative ones. Evidence directories were where things thinned out. Early inventories listed physical items, storage locations, transfer dates. In later years, some of those entries were replaced by summary documents, short write-ups dated long after the evidence was last logged. No indication of destruction, just narrative placeholders where files should have been. I told myself this was cleanup. Storage costs money, old evidence gets consolidated. That's normal. Oversight documentation followed the same pattern. Early on, there were review boards listed with multiple departments represented. As time went on, those bodies disappeared from the paperwork. Oversight was reduced to compliance checks handled internally. The names of committees vanished. What remained were references to guidelines and thresholds, as if the system no longer needed external confirmation. I kept telling myself this was just bureaucracy aging poorly, systems outliving the people who built them. But the more I compared cases, the clearer it became that these directories weren't about preserving unresolved investigations. They weren't trying to solve anything. They were tracking something ongoing. Not crimes exactly, but how cases behaved once they stopped moving, how long they stayed visible, how much attention they generated, when they became stable enough to manage rather than fix. Adjacent to the case directories were folders I hadn't opened at first because they didn't look relevant. They weren't labeled by jurisdiction or year. They used internal index numbers and generic titles. Once I did start logging them, it was clear they were derived from the case data, but not tied to individual incidents. Analytical reports, policy drafts, training materials. Everything referenced aggregated outcomes, not people or events. I noted titles and IDs only. Things like Module 3.2, Post-Investigative Engagement Management, Risk Model R17, Public Confidence Degradation, Response Framework, Prolonged Inactivity. There was very little ethical language. When it appeared, it was abstract and conditional. Harm was discussed as a variable. Exceptions were built into every process. Not edge cases, just expected deviations. As the documents progressed chronologically, accountability chains shortened. Early drafts listed review committees and external consultations. Later versions reduced those to internal approvals. Eventually, most documents referenced automated thresholds. Decisions weren't made, they were triggered. The language shifted accordingly. Assessment replaced review. Stability replaced closure. One planning memo stood out because it was unusually direct. I copied the line into my notes because it summarized the tone better than anything else. Prioritize system confidence over case resolution when objectives diverge. It wasn't framed as controversial, just operational guidance. There were no annotations arguing with it. I kept working longer than I usually would, not because I felt compelled, but because the structure was familiar. Cataloging, indexing, cross-referencing, the same habits I'd built doing contract cleanup. I did notice I was sleeping poorly. I logged that the same way I logged everything else. Longer sessions, more rechecks, no clear reason. The reports treated unsolved cases as data sets, inputs for modeling. Charts tracked public attention decay, media cycles, complaint frequency. Loss was quantified as exposure duration. Uncertainty had thresholds. Once a case passed certain metrics, it transitioned from active liability to background noise. That language appeared more than once. I didn't think of it as disturbing at the time. Institutions always reframe things. That's how scale works. But looking back, this was where the cases stopped being failures in need of resolution. They became tools, ways to measure how much absence people would absorb, how long unanswered questions could persist without destabilizing the larger system. The directories weren't preserving the unsolved. They were studying what happens when nothing is done, and whether anyone notices when that becomes standard.
The last change wasn't an intrusion. It logged as a permissions update. I noticed it because my mirror script flagged a delta in the root directory. One new file, no extension, time-stamped outside the batch windows I'd been seeing. It was tagged with my access hash. That stood out more than anything else. Not because it felt threatening, just because it implied continuity. I hadn't requested anything new. The file itself was small. Plain text, structured like an internal note rather than a report. Observational summaries about data handlers, engagement duration, frequency of access, likelihood of disclosure under different conditions. Most entries were anonymized, labeled by role or activity pattern. One line was addressed directly, active reviewer. It listed my average session length and a confidence score. I copied it into my notes the same way I copied everything else. There was no warning language, no demand. Looking back, I didn't treat it as a message. I treated it as another data set. Systems document their users. That's not unusual, especially systems that have been running for a long time. I assumed it was automated, a housekeeping function I hadn't triggered before. The internal language in that file matched what I'd already seen in the planning memos. Risk framed as probability, not consequence. Disclosure modeled as an outcome to manage, not prevent. There were references to partial release scenarios and containment via abstraction. That's what pushed my next decision. Not panic, just alignment. I didn't dump the archive. I released an outline of its structure and the metadata that described how it was organized. Index numbers, folder names, date ranges. Enough to show that it existed without reproducing the content. The risk models embedded in the files consistently treated full exposure as destabilizing. I followed that logic. I don't know if that was expected or just compatible. I backed up everything to cold storage. offline media, labeled and sealed the way I do for contract closeouts. Then I severed access, revoked my own credentials where I could, shut down the mirror. The root directory stopped responding after that. No error, just absence. This post isn't meant to expose crimes or solve cases. I'm not qualified for that, and the directories weren't built for resolution anyway. They were built to persist, to track what remains unanswered and how long it stays that way without breaking anything else. According to the logic inside the archive, preservation is the outcome. The system doesn't require answers. It requires that records remain intact, available if needed, and otherwise undisturbed. That's all I've done here. I've left a record that the records exist.